What's up guys, Justin here with the Rhino Essentials. So in today's video we're continuing our series on getting started with Rhino by talking about how we can start drawing 2D and 3D shapes in the program. Let's go ahead and just jump into it. All right, so remember that we're working within the Rhino workspace here, and by default it has 4 different windows. And so what you can do, one of the things that you can do is you can double click on a window in order to make it the large window. So we're going to start here, and then we'll double click on it again in a minute and take a look at what the multiple windows are doing. But the first thing I want to do is just show you how to draw inside of Rhino. And so the easiest way to do this is going to be to find a tool over here on the tool list, and then click on it in order to activate it. So in this case, for example, let's say that I wanted to draw a line. Well, I'm just going to click in here, and this is going to allow me to draw a polyline. And so notice how my mouse kind of changes to a little crosshair right here when I do that, meaning that whenever I click, it's going to place a point. And notice how with tools inside of Rhino, you're going to have different options for those tools up in the command line, which we can take a look at in a second. But in this case, notice how I can come in here and I can just click as many times as I want in order to place points in my polyline, like this. Now, notice how this is giving me different options in here for different modes, and notice how when you look at your different options up here in the command line, notice how there's options in here that you can either click on, or there's an underlined letter in the list. And so with the underlined letter in the list, notice how if you tap that key on your keyboard, so right, the close button, for example, if I was to tap C right here and hit the enter key, it's going to close that line. So with a tool active, you can either click on these or you can type in a key in order to modify what a tool is doing. But that's one way to draw things inside of Rhino, is to click on them over here. Another way that we can do that is within the command line, we can actually just type in the name of a tool. So for example, say I wanted to draw a circle. Notice how if I type in CI, it's going to automatically give me a list of things. It's basically going to search the tools within Rhino and give me a list of them to select from. And so I could just hit the enter key in order to activate a circle. So when I do that, right, I'm going to single click. Notice how this one works a little bit different in the sense that I can single click and move my mouse and then click again in order to create it. Now, with most of these tools, not only can you click and click in order to create them, you can also type in values. So for example, say that I was to activate the polyline tool again, set a base point, and then move my mouse. Notice how I've got a little measurement that's in here, so you can see how long this line is going to be, but you could also type in a value. So if I typed in a value of 10 feet, notice how that line is going to turn to 10 feet. Right here, and I can still move my mouse to set the direction that this is going to go, but I can use this in order to set different lengths just by typing. So if I type in 20 feet, it's going to go 20 feet. If I type in 15 feet, it's going to go 15 feet. And then once you're done, you can just right click in order to close out of the tool like this. Now, one thing that I want you to get very familiar with is the options for snapping, because snapping is going to become really valuable really quickly. And so one of the things that I usually toggle on is the option for ortho. And so when I tap on the option for ortho, or when I click on the option for ortho, notice how that becomes highlighted right here. Well, now if I was to type line right here and set a line based on a point, and we'll go ahead, notice how I can mouse over an endpoint right here and then move my mouse in order to get kind of an inference. So that means my first point would be aligned with this object. But notice how now if I move my mouse, the line is going to be snapping to an orthographic direction right here. So I can mouse over this point, then move my mouse over like this, and I can use this in order to quickly draw a line that's going to be the same length as the line between this point and this point. And when you have that orthographic snapping on, so I'm going to type line again, I'm just going to draw another line, notice how you can toggle that off by holding the shift key on your keyboard. Then if you let up on it, it's going to go back to the ortho snapping right here. So you can use that ortho snapping to only draw in certain directions like this. Now, let's go ahead And let's go back to our 4-window view. So I'm going to come in here. I'm just going to double click on the perspective view right here. Notice how now I've got these 4 different views in here that are showing me different views of the same models, like this. So I've got a perspective view, I've got a top view, a front, and a right view. Well, notice how when I come in here and draw, so if I type in L and then type in line like this, notice how you can see where that cursor is in multiple different directions by looking at the different windows. So all of these windows are live. And so I could come in here and I could set a base point right here, and notice how this tool is active. Well, I could mouse into this top view right here, or into the front view or the right view, and notice how that tool remains active. So if I wanted to draw a line up that was 20 feet long, I could move my mouse over into this viewport, type in 20 feet, and hit the enter key like this. So you can use multiple different windows at once in order to do this. And so this can get especially valuable when you start taking shapes to 3D. So right now, everything we've drawn has been just a series of edges, right? We've drawn edges for a polyline right here. We've drawn edges for our circle. These are all just a number of different edges. But what we can do is we can either take these shapes and extrude them to 3D, or there are tools within Rhino that draw 3-dimensional shapes. So for example, if I was to mouse over this box, and notice how I can click and hold in order to see other options, but if I was to click on this box and come in here and draw something like this, notice how what this is going to do is this is going to draw this in 3 dimensions. And so when I click, what that's going to do is that's going to draw a box that has different faces in it that's actually 3D. And you can see that 3D shape in all of the different windows. You can't really see it here because this is a top-down orthographic view, but you can see it in the other windows in 3D. Now, one thing that you can do is notice how this perspective mode looks a little bit different than the other modes. That's because this perspective mode is in shaded mode. But if I was to click over here, notice how this one is in wireframe mode, meaning it's only showing the edges rather than the shaded faces. And so if I wanted to see faces in my other views, I can just switch them to a shaded view like this. So just be aware that these have different looks to them right now, and you don't necessarily need to do that right at the moment, but just note that you can do that. Now, let's say that you wanted to draw something more complex than the primitive shapes that are over here, right? More than just like a cone or a torus or a cylinder. Say that you wanted to draw something using this object right here. And so let's say that we wanted to extrude this to 3D. So extruding is basically taking a series of edges and then kind of creating a copy of them and moving them up, but it fills in faces when you do that. And so there's a number of different tools inside of Rhino that can do that. But in this case, we want to select one called Extrude Curve, or Extrude CRV. So if I activate that, notice how within the command line, this is going to tell me what to do. It's going to say select curves to extrude. Well, in this case, I'm going to select this polyline right here. And notice how you could select multiple different things at once. We just want the polyline so we can hit the enter key. Well, notice how when we do that, now we can move our mouse and we can tell this a length to extrude this. So in this case, say we wanted to extrude this up 20 feet. You could type in a value of 20 feet. Now, note that when we do this right now, this is going to extrude this up, and it's going to extrude it as a solid, meaning it's going to cap both ends. That's an option that we have when we select an object. So if I take this, select it, and type in extrude curve, and extrude it up. First off, notice how I can use inferencing in here in order to set this to be the same length as other things. So when I'm just moving my mouse around, right, notice how this is moving up and down, but if I have the O snap or the object snapping toggled on, this is also going to give me snapping to these different points in here, so I could snap to different heights in here based on things that are already in my model. But then one other thing about this is notice how we have an option in here for solid. And so if I uncheck the box for solid, what that's going to do is that's going to extrude the curve, but it's not going to cap it like this. then you just get this extruded 3D shape right here, but there's no actual fill in here. And so depending on what you're trying to do, that could be good or bad. In this case, I would say it's just kind of an option, but you can use this in order to extrude objects to 3D. And notice how you can select multiple objects in here. You could type in extrude curve, and notice how I could extrude them all at once. Now, you don't have an option, like if I was to tap S on my keyboard and hit the enter key, that's going to switch the solid to yes. But since I'm just extruding individual edges like this, it doesn't really matter because there's no way to make them solid because they don't have like multiple faces in here to create a shape that's all closed in. So sometimes those options don't do anything depending on what you're trying to do. Now, let's talk a little bit about selecting objects and moving them around. So the first thing that you're probably going to want to do, or at least I do, I like to have this gumball tool active. And so right now, if I click off of this, so if I turn the gumball off and I select an object, notice what happens is I get this like yellow selection over top of the object like this. Well, I can't really do anything with this. I mean, I could take this and I could activate a tool, so I could type in move, and then it's going to ask me for a base point, and I can move it around like this. That's a valid way to move things around. I'm going to hit the escape key right here, but I like having the gumball active. So notice how if I click on this option for gumball right here, that's going to turn this little series of tools on. And so within this series of tools, what that's going to do is that's going to give me the ability to move the object by clicking on one of these directions. And I could type in a value, right? I could type in a value of 20 feet if I single click on this, or I could type in a value of negative 20 feet. And notice how this object is going to move just like this. So it's also got functions in here for doing things like rotating objects. And right now we're in that ortho snap mode, so it's only going to rotate to 90 degrees. But if you hold the shift key, notice how it's going to rotate like this. But you can also pick an edge, click on it, and then type in a number of degrees to rotate the object in order to rotate it to whatever direction you want. And so in addition, you can also use the gumball to scale objects like this. And then one of my personal favorites is you can also hold the Alt key and drag in order to create copies of objects with the gumball like this. You can create multiple different objects just by clicking and dragging. And so sometimes, now there is the option in here to relocate the gumball. So if I was to kind of scroll in on this thing a little bit, and we're just going to right click on the gumball option and click on the option to relocate, what you can do is you can pick a point, right? So maybe this point right here, and you can set the direction that the gumball is supposed to face. But notice how that's going to relocate that gumball to this corner point right here. And then you can click and drag that point in order to snap it to different things. So you can move it so that it's at a different point on the object right here. A lot of the time, if I'm just going to move an object, I maybe won't do that just because it's easier to just type in move, pick a base point, and then pick a target point really quickly. So there's multiple different options to do things like that within Rhino. Okay, and so while we're here, let's talk a little bit about how these shapes are made up. So I could take this object and I can use the gumball to move it around like this. So I'm just going to move it off into 3D space a little bit. But notice how this currently is basically a series of 6 faces that make up a cube. But if I click on it right here, notice how I'm getting the entire cube in here, which is fine, but say that you wanted to edit one thing. So say that you wanted to edit this face, for example. Well, you can actually edit a subpart of an object by doing a Control Shift on your keyboard. And when you hold Control and Shift, notice how this is going to start highlighting things for you so that you can see what you would be selecting. But if I click on this face right here, notice how that gumball is going to pop up. And now I can actually edit just the subpart of the object like this. Well, when I do this, what this is going to do is this is going to basically adjust the rest of the object to align with that change that I've made. So you can select subparts by doing a Control Shift click. And notice how you can select things like edges or points as well. So if I do a Control Shift click and I just click this point, and we'll just do a move planer in here. Notice how this is going to deform my object in here so that the edges still kind of align with where those vertex points are in the 3D space. And so one thing you might notice happened when we did that is the construction plane, or this three-dimensional plane that's in here, changed when we clicked on this face. That's because there's an option in here for auto C-plane. What that means is that when we do something like clicking on an individual object like this, that construction plane in our 3D space is going to automatically align with whatever we have selected in here. And so one way to reset that is you can just toggle off that auto plane like this. Notice how if I toggle that auto plane back on, then now if I click on an object, so if I do a Control Shift and click, it's going to align that construction plane to this object. But if you want to reset it, you can just toggle that auto C plane off to get it back to where it originally was. Okay, so one thing you might have noticed is if you're ever dealing with objects that occupy the same space, you might get a little menu that pops up in here. And so the way that's going to work is if I mouse over an edge right here and I click on this, notice how there's two objects that occupy this space. There's a curve and the extrusion. So we've got the line that we extruded and the actual extrusion itself, and they both occupy the same space. Anytime you click on an object that's applying the same space as another object in Rhino, this is going to give you a little window that, or this is going to give you a little menu that pops up where you can mouse over things like this and see what you're going to be selecting. So in this case, I want to select this curve, so I can just click on that curve right here and I can move it over. So if you ever have multiple objects occupying that same space, notice how you can use this menu in order to quickly select those things. And so the last thing I want to talk about in this video, and we'll get more in depth on specific examples in another video, but the last thing I want to talk about in this video is how you can split objects and use extrusions in order to customize shapes. So in this situation, what I want to do is I want to draw a curve across this surface, and then I want to use an extrusion in order to remove material. And you can do this with a tool that I think got added in Rhino 8 called push-pull. If you've ever used SketchUp, it's very similar to that. But what we need to do is we need to start by drawing a curve on this face. So I'm just going to mouse over this curves option. I'm going to click and hold, and I'm going to use this arc. It's basically a 3-point arc. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to draw a line along the surface, and I'm going to draw an arc. Like, we'll go ahead and do something like this. It doesn't really matter. Well, notice how when we do that, all that's done is we've got an object right here and we've got an object right here, but it hasn't really affected anything, right? If I do a Control-Shift click in here, this face is still just the face. It's not been affected by this curve. But what we can do is we can type in split face and hit the Enter key, and we can actually select a face, hit Enter, and then notice how there's an option over here to draw a polyline or to select a curve. I'm going to use the Select Curves option. I'm going to click on that curve and hit the Enter key. Well, notice how now if I do a Control-Shift and mouse over these, this split this into two objects, right? Well, if I was to select this object right here and move it down, what it's going to do is it's going to deform this face. So Rhino's going to come in here and it's going to basically move this face and make it more organic. I don't want to do that. I want to actually remove all of this material. And so what we can do is we can use that push-pull tool. So I'm going to type in push-pull and hit the Enter key. And notice what this is going to do if you have that face selected is it's going to let you move this object to either extrude it down, or if you go all the way to the bottom, it'll remove that material completely. And so what we've done is we've come in here and we've used a profile in order to make this surface look the way that we want. And so that can be massively helpful for a lot of different things. Like say, for example, I wanted to cut a hole in an object. So I'm going to create a rectangle right here. We're going to do an extrude curve. And in hindsight, I probably just could have used the rectangle tool, but that's okay. We've got this set to solid, so that's going to be fine. But say that you wanted to remove some material on this surface. And so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to come in here and I'm going to draw a polyline on this surface. And so one thing that you may want to do is make sure that you have auto C-plane toggled on, because I'm going to do a Control-Shift click and click on this face. But now on this face, I want to draw a polyline. So I'm just going to use the polyline tool in order to do this. We're gonna hit the enter key. Notice how that's been drawn on the face, but then I can do a split face. I'm gonna type in S to select a curve and hit the enter key. But again, notice what I've done is I've split that face. So if I do a Control Shift and mouse over this, I've drawn across this surface. Well, now if I type in push pull and use this tool and say I wanted to snap this to the midpoint, what it's gonna do is it's going to push pull this back to the midpoint right here. So you can use this in order to create and extrude shapes in 3D. All right, so that is a very fast overview of two-dimensional and three-dimensional modeling inside a Rhino. We'll get more into specific examples in the next video, but I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below. Do you have any questions about anything we talked about? I just love having that conversation with you guys. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this, and I'll catch you in the next video. Thanks, guys.